Hi, good afternoon. I would like to welcome you to the talk and lecture by Professor Lloyd Gardner this afternoon. I'm Klaus Lauers, and I'm the Richard M. Kressno Distinguished Professor in History and International Affairs here at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. I would like to thank Richard Kressno and the generous sponsors behind the Kressno Distinguished Professorship for making possible this lecture series on the United States and world affairs, the Cold War and beyond. I would also like to thank the staff of the Department of History for all their great help and support for organizing all this. I'm also very grateful to our cameraman, Phil, from our Center for European Studies, an EU-supported center of excellence. Phil will ensure that in a few days' time, the lecture today will be available on YouTube and on the UNC websites. It is a great pleasure and honor to welcome Professor Lloyd Gardner today. But let me ask, do you remember the Beatles? It was in the year 1963 that John, Paul, George and Ringo had their first UK hit. This was 2 years after the Berlin Wall was built. It was of course also in 1963 that John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas. In the same year, in 1963, and thus a little while ago, Lloyd Gardner began his long and uniquely successful career at Rutgers University in New Jersey. By this stage, Lloyd had already spent 3 years teaching and working for the US Air Force. Lloyd Gardner is one of America's most distinguished diplomatic historians. A former student of William Epperman Williams at the University of Wisconsin, he is the Charles and Mary Beard Professor of History at Rutgers University. A specialist in 20th century foreign policy, Gardner has held several national fellowships, including 2 Fulbright professorships in England and in Finland, and a Guggenheim Fellowship. Lloyd Gardner is the author or editor of more than 16 books on American foreign policy. And when I checked the catalog of the Library of Congress, there were actually 34 items, so some of them you don't even know and you're not aware of.
Or I'd like to forget about.
Among his many very readable books are such classics as Architects of Illusion, Man and Ideas, American Foreign Policy, 1941 to 1949. Covenant with Power, America and the World from Wilson to Reagan, or The Creation of the American Empire. Then Economic Aspects of New Deal Diplomacy, Imperial America, American Foreign Policy since 1898, and Pay Any Price, Lyndon Johnson and the Wars for Vietnam. Also Spheres of Influence, the great powers partition Europe, from Munich to Yalta. And I could go on and on and on. It is quite unbelievable how many excellent books Lloyd has produced over the years. At present, Lloyd Gardner is Emeritus Professor at Rutgers. But this semester, he is a Louis P. Johns Visiting Professor in History at Wofford College in Spartanburg, South Carolina. Thus, Lloyd is continuing to teach and publish. For example, only recently his book on 3 Kings, The Rise of American Empire in the Middle East, has been published. That was in 2009. In 2011, his most topical book came out on The Road to Tahrir Square, Egypt and the United States, from the rise of Nasser to the fall of Mubarak, if that isn't topical. And the second edition of his book on the 1932 kidnapping of Charles Lindbergh's 20-month-old baby is about to hit the bookstores. It is therefore a tremendous pleasure to welcome Lloyd Gardner today here at UNC in Chapel Hill. Today, Lloyd Gardner will talk about a view of the Imperial Presidency, developments from the war in Korea to Obama's war of the drones. There will be time for questions afterwards. Ladies and gentlemen, I have the great honor to present Professor Lloyd Gardner to you.
Thank you, Klaus. I have known Klaus for some time, and I should have known that he would come up with something like 34 extra items in the library or some such comment. And thank you for inviting me to North Carolina. It's a great pleasure to be here. First time I've been to Chapel Hill. It's a beautiful town, and I can well understand why my dear friend Richard Cohn came here after leaving Rutgers and spending time as a military historian in the Air Force, came to Chapel Hill. Dick and I used to teach the Cold War together for how many years? I don't know, several. But we planned a Friday afternoon class thinking that would hold the class size down. Particularly at an institution like Rutgers, where everybody scoots out Thursday night. Thursday night was the big party night, and then scooted out for home, but they still came. And when Dick left, he left me his notes, from which I could have published another 3 books, because they were very complete, complete with all citations and so on. So thank you for that treasure trove of notes, aside from everything else you left behind at Rutgers when you left, and we were sorry to see you go, obviously. I don't know how many of you are aware of or saw anything about the most important debate of the presidential season between Jon Stewart and Bill O'Reilly. I just picked this up this morning in USA Today. And apparently, at one point in the debate, O'Reilly held up a poster which said, drones, no waterboarding. And he was actually making an important point, which I don't think most of the people were picking up. It was a shot at Obama, obviously. But the right-wing critique of Obama has taken some very interesting paths as they try to find a way to attack his foreign policy. And O'Reilly was actually repeating criticisms made by John Yoo, the man who drafted the torture memos in 2001, 2002, and a critic of those, also on the right, at least he was in the Bush administration, Jack Bellinger, who has also critiqued Obama's use of drones in the Great War on Terror. And Bellinger's used criticism held that instead of waterboarding, we were killing the enemy, and that this was depriving us of the chance to interrogate them. And so therefore, this was a mistaken policy. But he also thought it was nice to point out the hypocrisy of the Obama administration. Jack Bellinger, on the other hand, was saying, in effect, that Obama was misusing the authorization to use military force, which was passed in the wake of 9/11, a few days after the attacks of 9/11, which authorized the president to use military force as he saw fit to attack those who had attacked the United States and who might have aided them. And Bellinger was saying that Obama was stretching this so far, so completely, so that he was in fact misusing and overusing this particular piece of legislation. Now, what is very interesting to me about this whole debate is that they come out of what I would call a new institution in the Imperial Presidency, and that is the Office of Legal Counsel. Who had heard of this before 9/11? Not very many people at all. It only really becomes famous after 9/11 with the torture memos, and now again with the memo which Obama solicited from the Office of Legal Counsel to allow him to send a missile, a drone, against an American citizen in Yemen. A 50-page memo of which we are still not allowed to see. It has been leaked, it has been discussed almost to end. We know essentially what was in it because of the speeches that Obama has orchestrated by Jack Brennan, his counterterrorism advisor, by Eric Holder, his Attorney General, and by Harold Koh, his appointment to the Office of Legal Counsel in the Department of State. And all these people have talked around this memorandum, have provided elliptical justifications for this memorandum, but the people are still not permitted to see it. And the argument that is given by one anonymous administration official, there seems to be an entire core of anonymous administration officials who do nothing but walk around and talk to the press and say, "I am anonymous." And this particular member of the anonymous corps said, well, George Washington didn't say which redcoats he was going to attack, as if this sufficed for satisfying public questioning about what was going on in America's name. Now, having said that, I'm going to segue just a bit to say that I think American foreign policy is made at sort of the intersection of three I's: institutions, ideas, and individuals. And the Office of Legal Counsel is one of those institutions which grew up in the atomic age. And obviously the individuals and the ideas we'll talk about in a minute. In 1889, jumping from 2012 back a few years, in 1889, America's most famous humorist, Mark Twain, published a novel entitled A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court. Now, that font of modern knowledge, Wikipedia, tells us that A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court is a satirical novel. I'm not entirely sure that's true. I don't think that you get to the depths of Mark Twain by calling it a satirical novel. He's often very dark in what he has to say in a humorous fashion. The novel concerns a young mechanic by the name of Hank Morgan who is struck over the head in the factory and transported to King Arthur's court in his unconsciousness. And there he does battle with Merlin. Merlin is his main enemy. Remember, Merlin was the wizard at King Arthur's court. He defeats Merlin in a series of encounters by using technological methods against magic. And I think this hits at the core of one of the determinants of American policy and attitudes, and that is that we have a technological edge on the rest of the world, and that technological edge also at times equals moral superiority and ethical superiority. The instance I want to give you here is, of course, the creation of the atomic bomb. And the I that I want to use here is secrecy, the idea secrecy. This was the largest secret project in American history. And it gave the president immense powers. It gave him, as Truman himself said, this is the greatest thing on earth. And when Charles de Gaulle at the end of World War II asked him if it wouldn't be necessary to sign a security treaty with the United States, Truman said, don't you understand, we have the bomb. And the bomb has made all security treaties unnecessary. Now, he changed his mind about that. But the first impression was that the bomb and technological superiority had completely outmoded diplomacy of the kind of treaties and so on and so forth. So what he thought was liberating was in fact entrapping. And I don't think that he quite grasped that at that time, or that any president quite grasped it, because the bomb has imposed an incredible load, an incredible pressure upon the president. All during the Cold War, a military officer carried around chained to his wrist a football-shaped code, which would allow the president to launch a bomb instantaneously if he received word that the United States was under attack. So this was a terrible burden that was placed upon the presidency at that time, but it also raised expectations of the American people tremendously, in the sense that they now believed that the president could protect them against all evil. Accompanying this was then the creation of several institutions with the 1947 National Security Act, which created the Central Intelligence Agency, which created the joint, which collapsed the military into the Department of Defense, giving the United States Air Force, the deliverer of the weapon, equal stature with the Navy and with the Army, and many people would say more than equal stature with the Army and the Navy. The Central Intelligence Agency was created by this. At first, Truman was leery of the Central Intelligence Agency. The Central Intelligence Agency was actually probably directly responsible in the first place from the Pearl Harbor attack and the congressional investigations after Pearl Harbor. What went wrong? Why didn't we know it was coming? We have to create a national agency. And I think Truman had an inkling that this agency was going to grow and grow and grow and become what it is today. What it is today is an operation which is equal to the military in carrying out drone attacks in countries outside of Afghanistan. Most of the drone attacks that are carried out outside of Pakistan, are carried out by the Central Intelligence Agency. So you had the creation of these institutions in 1947. And in a sense, Congress sort of handed over the Imperial Presidency to the President with that act in 1947. It was almost as if there was an audible sigh of relief by Congress that it had done this, that it had relieved itself, having carried out the Pearl Harbor investigation in 1946 and turning this power over to the President. Not that it wouldn't criticize, not that there wouldn't be future things, but in a sense, Congress was complicit in creating the Imperial Presidency. Let's leave out the Constitution for a while, for a moment. We'll come back to that in a moment. But I'm taking you to 1947 and what Congress did in 1947 in passing that act. Then we come to the Korean War. And this was a puzzlement. This was the first war in the atomic age. It came after the Russian atomic bomb, after the Chinese Revolution, which had shattered the illusion that the president could protect Americans. But still this had to be restored. So one of the first things we did was to double down on the technology and go for the super, go for the H-bomb. Now the H-bomb is a weapon which is totally unuseful in war. It is simply an intimidation more than anything else, and I think most American leaders understood that. But they also understood that going for the H-bomb would postpone any unpleasant negotiations or any getting back into the world of diplomacy and so forth. But then along came Korea. What are we going to do with the North Korean attack? How are we going to respond to this? After all, Dean Acheson, the Secretary of State, had said Korea is outside our defense perimeter. In January 12, 1950, he had said this. When the attack began, he went into his office, as he recalls in his memoirs, and spent about 24 hours thinking about what to do. Truman was down in Missouri taking care of some business, so Acheson was really thinking out the strategy that was necessary. Now, according to the Constitution, an attack upon the United States could be responded to by the President, but something which was not clearly an attack upon the United States was something that Congress presumably should have to declare war. That's reserved in the Constitution. The Congress should declare war, but Acheson did not want to get into that. He did not want to get into that for several reasons, one of which was it might lead to a debate. There were, after all, a bunch of old isolationist senators, and they might cause trouble. And we know that isolationists are bad and that they don't have any ideas. And so therefore you don't want to get into a debate over having a declaration of war. That was one of the reasons. The second was, in the atomic age, could you afford a declaration of war which might lead to a broader war than Korea? It's important to keep this local. And third, this was very likely going to be the first of what you might call post-colonial wars. Because after all, Korea had been a colony of Japan, unwillingly, very unwillingly, since 1905. And the Korean struggle was more than a struggle between two individual leaders. It was a struggle of all Koreans to try to figure out their destiny. And this was a lot like the post-colonial wars that would happen. So Acheson had to think about all three of these things, and what he concluded was that the United States had to respond in some way, because while it was not a direct attack upon the United States, it was a direct attack upon the idea of American power, the shadow of American power, and that was important. So how to do this? Acheson dreamed up the first of the things that would become useful down to and including President Obama and Libya. And that is, you use an extra American source for authority. In this case, a vote in the United Nations. And it was so convenient that Russia was not acting at that time on the Security Council, because it was having an argument with the West about which China to seat. So therefore, it was possible to get an authorization from the United Nations. The second thing was what to do about Congress. Well, Scott Lucas was called in, a senator, and they had discussions in the White House, and he said, don't turn this over to Congress. We might get a congressional resolution from Congress. Don't you ask for one. There might be one coming from Congress. So the next day, on June 26, 27th, the press gave Truman the answer he was looking for to the problem of Congress, how to deal with Congress. The press said, Mr. President, in the press conference, are we at war? And Mr. Truman said, no, of course we're not at war. Mr. President, are we going to send troops to Korea? No, I haven't thought about that yet. I haven't completely thought that through. Well, what would you call it, Mr. President? A police action? And you could almost see the light bulb go off over Truman's head. Police action, yes, that's exactly what it is. We will deal with these bandits from the north, and so on. And so began, with Dean Acheson and the invoking of the United Nations, and the press conspiring without meaning to, in the description of what Truman would use for the Korean War, which helps to launch the Imperial Presidency. A few months later, after things had not gone well, of course, the UN names a commander, General MacArthur. Now, who else was that going to name? Pandit Nehru? I don't think so. The UN named General MacArthur, and we immediately sent over a bunch of blue flags to put on jeeps. And that was about the extent of the original United Nations presence in the Korean War. But, of course, we lined up all these other people to help come in and give us many flags in Korea. But at any rate, a few months later, things had not gone well. MacArthur had overstepped. He'd been warned. He overstepped. He moved too close to the Yalu. Wham! The Chinese come in. It's an entirely new war. MacArthur complains, it's time to consider either using the bomb or to put radioactive cobalt along the Yalu. This was kind of scary. This is not what Acheson had in mind. This is not what Truman had in mind at all. And then there was one of those cantankerous people who to presidents just drive them crazy at press conferences. You know, people like Helen Thomas and people before Helen Thomas, May Craig. Now, I remember watching May Craig on television. She reminded me of my female dentist I had when I was that was back when grills went, you know, that kind. She really hurt. But May Craig said, Mr. President, are you considering using the atomic bomb? And that was a question that Truman had actually been tossing around without really intending to use it. And everybody was scared when he said, well, it's always possible that the commander and so on. And so he stumbled around a lot about that. And he made some equivocal statement about that. And she said, Mr. Truman, Mr. President, if you were in fact considering using the bomb, does this now require you to call Congress on this and get Congress authorization? And Truman said, it might. It might. That's all he said. in response to May Craig. But what had been planted in the Truman administration now? The idea that the president could send thousands and thousands of troops to a foreign country that had not attacked us without calling upon Congress to authorize him in a declaration of war. And second, what had been established was to use the authority of an international organization to bolster the president's policies in the war situation. These were two crucially important precedents because they will be used over and over and over again, along with some congressional authorizations. And you can see this in the 1950s with the Eisenhower Doctrine and getting authorization to go into the Middle East after the 1956 Egyptian invasion by England, France, and Israel. But you can see it also in other instances. I'm going to move along quickly now. In 1968, when President Johnson had sent more than 500,000 troops to South Korea without a declaration of war and simply on the basis of the Gulf of Tonkin resolution in 1964. Johnson used to carry two slips of paper in his coat pocket. One was the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, the original one, in which he said if Congress wants to repeal that, they can do that. Of course, that means they're deserting the troops and so on. But if they want to do that, they can go and try that. And the other was his cardiogram to show that he was going to be around for a considerable period. So, in congressional testimony in 1967, Nicholas Katzenbach, the Undersecretary of State, was questioned by Fulbright and others. Mr. Secretary, Mr. Katzenbach, do you believe that the president can send 500,000 troops on the basis of this piece of this Tonkin resolution? And Katzenbach said, in the atomic age, the Gulf of Tonkin resolution is the moral equivalent. It is the equivalent of a declaration of war. At which point Senator Gene McCarthy leaped out of his chair, ran out into the hall and said, either that man doesn't know the Constitution or I'm crazy. But it didn't really matter that much because the United States had sent 500,000 troops into South Vietnam on the basis of the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. And I don't think that would have been possible without all the precedents that had been set during the Truman period in terms of its treatment and its police action. Remember, all through the Vietnam War, Lyndon Johnson said, we seek no wider war. We seek no wider war. At the time he sent 100,000 troops, he said that, and continued up until finally reached the situation where Richard Nixon actually conducted various secret campaigns in Cambodia, etc., still under the basic authorization of the Gulf of Tonkin resolution until Congress finally repealed that. When Nixon got in trouble in the crisis over the Watergate tapes, Al Haig, who was sitting in for Henry Kissinger, was asked what his primary duty was, and Haig said not to protect Richard Nixon, but to protect the institution of the presidency, because it's so important to the American people and to the world. So in effect, Haig was perfectly prepared to sacrifice Nixon to save the presidency as he saw it. Okay. So now we come down to the more modern period, as you would call it, I suppose, or still not within your memory. It's hard for me to keep in mind that the first Gulf War, most of you don't remember very much about the first Gulf War in 1991. When Dick and I started teaching the Cold War, The same thing was true of students then. They didn't really remember the origins of the Cold War, which were so close in our minds. But at that time, George H.W. Bush invoked, first of all, a vote by the U.S. Congress in favor of taking action in order to get a United Nations vote to support him. And he then had a double justification. But he said in his memoirs that no matter how that vote would have gone in Congress, he would still have gone in. He planned still to go in. He did seek congressional authorization, but he said if it had not been given, he would still have gone in. In Gulf War II, the situation was reversed, and that was that Bush got a vote in the UN in order to get a vote in Congress to support him, or to try to support him. So, again, the use of international agencies in order to obviate and in order to avoid, secondly, calling anything a war. Use any term except a war, which brings up the problem of congressional responsibility, congressional authorization. Now, during the during the Second Gulf War, you had the Office of Legal Counsel stepping in to make these decisions on what was torture and what was not torture, and to give advice to the President in this case, by John Yoo and by others. And these became the subject of heavy, heavy criticism, including that by the new candidate for the presidency, Barack Obama. Obama said in a speech in 2007, in one of his original speeches on foreign policy, that there was no need to choose between national security and our national institutions and our ideas of what was just and right. And that was part of our strength. He made that clear throughout 2007 and 2008. What was less clear at the time was that he was also very well committed to the Afghanistan situation. Everybody who supported him thought these were just simply throwaway lines, that he was not really going to carry out a surge in Afghanistan that would bring American forces to 100,000. But again, if you go back to those 2007 speeches, you notice as well that candidate Obama accepted the basic premises of COIN, which was the key word, counterinsurgency, in the Pentagon at the time, and talked in his Wilson Center speech about the lawless borderlands between Afghanistan and Pakistan, where nobody can reach, and so on and so forth, and where a new manual is being devised for this, and so on. He seemed to have advanced knowledge of that. So we knew, some of us at least, that he was interested in COIN, even if we were not at all convinced that he was interested in sending 100,000 troops to Afghanistan. What was less noticed was that he had a very great interest in the new drones, in the new use of drones as a weapon in the Great War on terror. And I don't think this really came out very heavily until probably 2010. He stepped up the use of drones in 2009, and two COIN specialists, Kilcullen and Exum, actually wrote an article, an op-ed piece in the New York Times, in which they criticized the use of drones in this, because I think they saw a little bit of what was coming. But I think the real shift, the real pressure toward the use of drones came in the spring of 2010. And a couple of things happened in 2010 that helped this argument. One was the basic failure of the Marja campaign that was supposed to set a new, reverse the Taliban momentum in Afghanistan and put the United States on the path of solving the Afghan problem. That was one thing. And remember, that's the time when General McChrystal talked about having a government in a box ready to roll out. And when they got there, they found that the box was empty and that really there was a great deal of resentment of American forces. The second was the failed explosion in Times Square of a bomb by a naturalized former Pakistan citizen who was a naturalized American citizen. And I think both of these things pushed Obama more towards reliance on special ops and drones. If you read the papers carefully, you see that the special ops people are saying that, in fact, President Obama was more favorable to their presence, to their influence, than President Bush had been, that he was more interested in it, because he saw it essentially as a way of striking quickly with fewer troops and using America's technological superiority. Again, using this. And this was the latest example, it seems to me, of the belief in the technological superiority being a liberating factor in American foreign policy, when it in fact is an entangling factor. So President Obama has now, in his 4 years, already launched more than 5 times the number of drone attacks that President Bush used. You could say, well, this is just simply a continuation. And I would agree that it is continuation. I mean, I think that's the point, that it is a continuation. It is a continuation in the American preference for technological activity instead of diplomatic activity. At Potsdam, Truman had said at one point to his Secretary of State, "We've been here 12 whole days. You can solve any problem in 12 days." And this is, again, typical of the American attitude toward policy matters. Leon Panetta has spoken of drones as a way of de-escalation. We can de-escalate. Here we have a problem of how we're going to evacuate from and get out of Afghanistan safely. And Panetta said that this is not only the only game in town, that's one of the things he said, but it's in fact de-escalation. Well, then, just this year, toward the end of April, beginning of May, there exploded this huge article in the New York Times, which explained how the decisions are being made and who to pick to choose for attacks. And there are 2 kinds of attacks. Of course, personality attacks, a specific person, or signature attacks in which you attack a group of people that are in the wrong place at the wrong time and are very suspicious in their activities. The number of actual civilian casualties that have been caused by drones, and what does civilian in this sense mean? I'm not sure what it means. Everybody that's an informal terrorist is still a civilian according to various definitions of warfare, but they're still terrorists. But more than that, the very process of a group of people meeting in the Oval Office to decide who is to live and who is to die raises all kinds of ethical questions. It reminds one, and this term hasn't been used, but it reminds one of Star Chamber courts in Great Britain, a small group of privy councillors sitting around deciding who will live and who will die. And on the one hand, in the same article, you have that Obama reads Aquinas and St. Augustine on just war, and this is how he makes his decision. He wants to take personal responsibility. And then in the next paragraph, you read that his political advisor, David Axelrod, is present at all of these discussions to talk about how this might play out in the political arena. And this is open news. This you read in the New York Times. And the New York Times, that paragon of Western journalism, which so far as I can see, most nearly represents what the old London Times was, a Tory respectability in the United States. The New York Times did one editorial in which it said that this is too much for any one person to have power, too much power for any one person to have. And then it dropped it. One editorial, and it dropped it. Dropped the subject. Where are we? Well, I'm 45 minutes, and that's about what I'm supposed to talk about in my first talk. But where are we in terms of anything happening to change all these things that I think are so deeply embedded in the American character, in the American political personality? I don't offer very much optimism because I think they are so deeply embedded. I don't think arguments going to the Constitution are going to get very many people excited or upset. They get academics upset. They may provide a basis for things, but if there's to be any change, it's going to come from things like the civil rights movement, in other words, NGO movements that create pressures outside of regular channels, civil rights movement, feminist movement, et cetera, movements. I hesitate to use the environmental movement because it's not even a subject in this year's presidential debates. It's so low on the scale of thinking, and yet it represents the greatest possible calamity that can occur. So what have I tried to say today, and then I'll turn this over to question, that the Imperial Presidency is not entirely predetermined at all. It's the result, it seems to me, of a number of factors, and there are contingencies along the way. Presidents reach out for power. It's a natural thing. The people want presidents to have. Who do we think of as our greatest presidents? We don't think of Calvin Coolidge as our greatest president, James Buchanan, and so on. All the presidents we think of our greatest presidents reach out for more power in one way or another. Whether or not our fixation on technology as the solution to our political problems will ever really be dented by anything, I don't know. And so I leave you with more questions than answers.
Thank you, Lloyd. This was a very interesting, informative, and indeed enlightening talk. But let me, before we open it up for general answers and questions, let me just play devil's advocate. What is wrong with using drones? Isn't it a nice way of getting rid of terrorists without an invasion, preserving the life of American soldiers and money and finances, and still get the job done? So what's wrong with it?
Yes. Well, that's the argument, isn't it? I mean, that's the argument.
Give us the answer.
That's the me. First of all, I think it puts in the hands of one man the power of life and death in a way that Congress, when it first started out, and I know I said shouldn't appeal to the Constitution, but I will here. But one of the reasons that Congress was vested with the only right to issue letters of marque and reprisal was because it feared leaders who would start wars for their own private reasons. In the past, we heard George W. Bush say that one of the reasons he wanted to get Saddam Hussein was because he tried to kill my father. And yet the explanation that was used was weapons of mass destruction. The second thing is that when Harold Coe, who used to be the current legal advisor to the Department of State, used to attack George Bush, he now uses this authorization for military force as a justification. You can carry that anywhere. You can become involved in foreign quarrels, like in the Yemen, on one side or another, because the man that you're allied with happens to see them as political enemies, and yet the president is given this evidence. The third thing is we don't know what evidence is presented to show that these people should be on a death list. We have no idea because this is all kept confidential. And in the CIA, there was a guy who was doing some of the original screening, and he was pictured like Control in a James Bond movie in the papers. A chain-smoking man who says, "We're killing the bastards faster than they can grow them." I mean, these are decisions that are being made on the basis of what evidence? We don't know. We're not even given the 50-page memorandum which justified this. The next reason is use of drones is not simply to kill individuals, but to intimidate entire groups. The drones overhead have an intimidating factor. They're used to do this. And this is the way in which you build up more enemies than you kill instead of the reverse. So for every argument that you put forward here, I would put forward one which counterbalances that and makes it a bad idea.
Thank you. And of course it also leaves the issue of American citizens who are being killed by the drones as well.
Exactly, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Thanks very much. Let's open it up to questions from the audience. Justin, please.
That's a good segue into my question. It was an American citizen killed in Yemen, was it not? And if that was by a drone attack, then what is this about the CIA operating these personal attacks on individuals is not assassination? And I think that, John, you would have something to justify that with. I'm very interested in that justification of how it goes from assassination to a language of personal attacks on individual terrorists.
Yeah, John, you mean, what would, you pulled John Yu's name up there quickly, and I wanted to be sure what you're saying, John Yu would think about this?
Or what would does he at all justify it? I think the Bush administration used him to justify things as well, and now we hear about him in the Obama administration justifying these individual attacks for the White House. I was interested in the language being used from assassination to personal attacks by drones targeting individual terrorists instead of just assassination.
Well, that's John Yu's argument about what we did, that instead of using war, he says we're killing them instead of questioning them, and we're therefore depriving ourselves of sources of information. That is his argument. If we want to talk about the specific attack on Iraqi, and that was presumed that you're talking about, I think this was an attack of revenge as much as anything else. I think that because he had corresponded with the major down in Fort Hood, Texas, who shot the American soldiers, that it was at that point, after he had been identified previously as preaching and so on and so forth, that they decided that they would attack him. And in a sense, I think this is again an example of intimidation, an attempt to use this policy as intimidate larger groups of people. That's what bombing is. That's why Winston Churchill wanted to bomb the Iraqis in the 1920s, that he would bomb a few tribes and they would settle down. I think this is just one more step up on that ladder.
Thank you.
Is that,
sorry. Thank you. Daniel?
Thank you for a very enlightening talk. I have two questions, one more historical and then one more presentist. The historical question...
Can you speak up a bit?
Yeah, I have two questions, one historical and one more presentist.
Right.
The historical question, when you were talking about technology, it started me thinking about progressivism. And it seems like one strand of progressivism is the technological, and then the other strand, especially really ratcheting up in the 20s with Walter Lippmann and John Dewey and a bunch of other people, is sort of removing the public from foreign policy making. And I think that's sort of expressed in the institutions, both governmental and non-governmental, of the national security state.
Yes.
So I'm just curious about your opinion regarding the role of progressivism. It seems like this is the apex of this 120-year project to remove the public from foreign policy making. That's actually a progressive philosophy, and that's why it's very, you see it in liberal internationalism and you see it with Obama. That's the historical question. And then just very briefly, the more presentist question, it doesn't seem like there could possibly be a civil rights movement in questions of foreign policy. You have it with, you had it in the mid-2000s with in relation to Iraq, but that seems to me in retrospect to be more of an anti-George W. Bush than this sort of pro-anti-interventionist attitude. So what do you say about that, the fact that the left has completely given up on all of these civil libertarian issues with Obama's election? So it seems to me that there's no real interest in that whatsoever, even among the so-called American left.
True. The short answer to your question is yes. Well, if you go to the historical one, that is really, really that's the fascinating one. The whole notion of progressivism and so on. You know, one of the progressive reforms was the electric chair, because it was less brutal than hanging, presumably. Eugenics, big progressive issue. And at one point Hitler said, you know, I admire the United States, they're ahead of us in eugenics, and so on. There's that whole strain of the progressive idea, which is to make us stronger. It was called, there's a Bernard Semmel's book, Social Imperialism, about the British statesmen around the turn of the 20th century, many of them who thought in these terms of progressive reforms in order to make us tougher and stronger imperialists. So that's absolutely true. Now, the movements today, they don't seem very strong, do they? I mean, and I think that's why Daniel Ellsberg and other people, and Andy Bacevich and so on, like to bring back the draft. You bring back the draft, you might get, because we're completely disengaged from the military now. You know, so unless you have a friend or somebody. So that might be one way in which to trigger this. Maybe not. I don't know.
Thank you. Richard Cook. Lloyd, I have two questions too also, one historical and one a contemporaneous devil's advocate argument. The historical one is, why do you let Dwight Eisenhower, who has had this great renaissance, off the hook? That is a president who
the clock.
Pardon?
The time.
Oh, all right. Because he started the covert action.
Oh,
he's bumping off, overturning governments. The culmination is the removal of the gems, and so on, and the whole assassination business, which, by the way, is illegal under American law.
Yeah, no.
So now let me turn to the contemporary.
No, I agree with you 100%, but I look up at the watch and I've just gotten through Mark Twain, and then there's so much time.
We ought to drop, substitute Eisenhower for Twain. The other argument is that we made a huge mistake, it seems to me, by declaring a war on terrorism, which is ridiculous. And instead, if we had criminalized what these people are, they are really criminals and mass murderers. Trying to bring people who are plotting mass murder to justice under a law enforcement regime would mean that you would try to arrest them. But if they resist arrest, they cannot be brought and tried, then you have to, as you do sometimes with a John Dillinger or a babyface Nelson, you knock them off instead. Now that might be an analogy that to some degree justifies what we are doing with drones. Yes, we could send in 50 or 100 special forces and get lots of people killed and violate sovereignty and create chaos in the international order, or we could try to prevent, in a sense, mass crime, which you do under the law enforcement kind of protocols or concepts. If you know a killer is out there and you can't, or resists arrest and won't come up for the trial.
I have no disagreement with that in the sense that you're talking about it, but it seems to me all the evidence now is that we're using drones as the best way to wage this kind of warfare without, for example, the number of top men who were taken out. We're now down into the, as they call it, the foot soldiers, the Taliban. And yet at the same time, the American military will tell you that a lot of these guys are simply doing it because they get more money working for the Taliban than they do for the other side. So how far down the scale are you willing to go? That's the, seems to me, the problem. The second thing is nobody sees this evidence except this small group of people in the White House. And the evidence as it's compiled and so on, after all, these are humans, and there's no check on this. There's no check that perhaps the president of Yemen wants a particular guy taken care of. The third thing is that Harold Koch himself, who I think has degraded his morality by the speeches he's been giving in defense of this, Harold Koch himself said, using the authorization to use military force law passed in September, anyone who, now he extends it from attacking or planning attack, anyone who is injuring American interests. And that is such a completely vague term that it's frightening in its possibilities.
Thanks very much. I think a few of our students have to leave now. Let's take the 10 seconds break here so they can sneak out without too much problems. They have another seminar, so it's not that they didn't like your lecture.
So that's all right. It's fun. I appreciate you coming.
Lloyd Kramer.
Well, thank you for a very interesting talk, and I'd like to sort of broaden the framework, and you call this a distinctive aspect of the Imperial Presidency. We might say the claim that certain people have life and death power over others, and using technologies in ways that are taking people out. But isn't this, or is this something unique to the American Imperial Presidency, or isn't this in fact the way all, and not to defend it one way or the other, but all powers throughout human history have resorted to this kind of behavior, using the justification that we need to do this to save either our lives, our influence. You know, you go through the wars of religion, the wars of other empires, the wars of all the way back to antiquity. Targeted assassinations are a very common tool used by people in power. So my question is there something unique about the way American foreign policy is doing this that makes it different from other such interventions all through history? Or even most recently, for example, the Israelis have constantly used targeted assassinations in the Middle East to take out people who are deemed to be terrorists. And anyway, it's a very common strategy.
Well, I don't think Americans are uniquely villainous in this. And I agree with you absolutely that all through history these kinds of practices have been enforced. And all through history we have tried to devise laws to prevent them from getting out of hand and from being used. In other words, we like to think of the idea that there's been an evolution in thinking about what can and can't be done. The Geneva Convention on Torture, for example. Yet the Office of the Legal Counsel seems set up simply to allow the president to get around any laws that are set up to do this. Now, if we want to claim to be the leading power, not simply militarily, but also to be leading the world toward some sort of reasonable accommodation and so on, you can't go around having the Office of Legal Counsel simply get around things like the Geneva Convention. The other thing is that, and Harold Koch talks about this in his speeches, and so do some of the conservative lawyers, what they're afraid of right now is what they call lawfare. And lawfare is the world's various countries ganging up on the United States saying what you're doing is wrong. And we resent very much that some of the countries that sit on these councils, in fact, have repressive regimes and so on. Yet, we still feel it necessary to answer to these things, or attempt to answer to these things. And I don't think you do that by keeping secret a 50-page memorandum in which you say you're doing it. This only leads, it seems to me, to the possibility that in somebody else's hands, suppose, I mean, you may defend what Barack Obama is doing, but suppose it was somebody else that you don't like who's in. And that's where I think the American left has let down. They've left Obama off the hook on all these issues. It's almost as if, my God, the alternative is so horrible that we can't say anything. And I think that's very unhealthy for American democracy.
Thank you. Let's assume Romney comes into power in January next year.
Well, he's promised to reestablish more strenuous forms of interrogation. I mean, he said that in his campaign, that if he gets into power, he will go back and do this. Now, whether this is simply one more case of Etch-a-Sketch Romney or not, I don't know. But it's partially also an answer to your thing, and that is that the farther you push in this direction, there are always going to be people who are going to push farther and farther and farther unless you take a stand at some point. Unless you spend some capital on closing Guantanamo after you promised that you would do it. Unless you take a definite stand on many of these issues, then you're always going to be hit because you didn't do enough. You're going to be hit from both sides in the situation.
Thank you. This gentleman.
You could take the stand to just stop the use of drones. That would be one conclusion to draw to prevent the kind of immoral, illegal activity that you describe.
I think
or can you imagine what kind of machinery or process could you create that would place some check upon the president's use of this device that would be less secret, to use your term? What kind of machinery could you visualize where you could use the drones but avoid the abuse you described?
All right, the first question I would ask in response to that is that how many of these people that are being attacked by drones actually are capable of attacking the United States? In other words, it doesn't seem to me that there are very great many people who are actually capable of attacking the United States, except with things like these bombs in the underpants and so on and so forth, and this kind of thing. The original attack in 2001 in Afghanistan could have probably pinned down Osama bin Laden had we not been then distracted by this weapons of mass destruction notion, and the forces pulled out of there and shifted over to Iraq. So, in other words, we made a mistake there, a very big one. We engendered a lot of enemies. We did a lot of things that made things worse than they had been. Instead of and we completely got out of Afghanistan, practically ignored it, and allowed the Taliban to come back into power, essentially. So we created our own problem. So then you say, all right, what other solution do we have except drones? Perhaps it would be to step back and say, how much of a threat do these people actually represent to America? Not American lives, not to American interests, which are defined in a whole variety of ways. Is it to our interest? Is it really worth alienating all the people of Pakistan and creating a situation where the Pakistan government becomes more and more unstable in order to use drones to take out people in Northwest Waziristan? I'm not sure that if you had a full-scale debate on that you would come down on the side of continuing the drone attacks in Pakistan. And as far as Al-Qaeda in Yemen or Somalia, these are people who are involved in civil wars with the governments that they're involved in. Their most pressing issue is, while they curse the United States and use the drones as example to go after the United States, is a local question, local issues that have to be resolved. See, that's where I would begin.
Thank you. Mike Morton.
In your talk, you traced the growing American uneasiness with the language of war since the Second World War, the refusal to use the language of war in talking about military action abroad. I wonder to what extent this is not, picking up on Lloyd's point, not solely an indigenous or domestic American process, but rather reflects changes in the international system. Specifically, the creation of the UN seems to me makes it possible to use the language of crime rather than the language of war to talk about the use of military force. We talk about enforcing UN resolutions rather than war on behalf of the UN, for example. So my question is, to what extent is this process you describe actually reflective of this broader international shift in the way that we understand the use of force globally and not just a domestic American phenomenon?
Yeah, but in both the Kosovo and the Libyan situation, we didn't use the UN, we used NATO as the international justification. And I think that we ought to pay very careful attention to President Morsi of Egypt when he goes to the UN and says, what continent does not have a seat on the UN Security Council, a veto power seat? One whole continent, and that whole continent is Africa. It does not have that kind of representation. So it seems to me that that's the sort of thing we should be looking at if you're going to talk about global responsibilities, etc. Now, is Morsi going to survive his tightrope walking between the Brotherhood and the military in Egypt? I don't know. But he comes up with a point that really is at the heart of what we've been discussing, and that is that these drones are also always used against areas that are not industrialized, not what we call modern or whatever, but against peoples that we feel superior to in many respects. I'm not talking about people in this room. I'm talking about the general feeling that you can use these kinds of weapons against these people because, after all, who are they? But then, of course, the blowback from this, they do go down. And a perfectly good drone went down in Iran. And what does President Obama say? We demand to have this drone back. What do you mean? You violated Iranian airspace and you demand to have the drone back when it's shot down? I mean, that's the kind of double standard that's involved in the drones to begin with, which is so intimidating and which I think is so unhealthy for American democracy and American position in the world.
Thank you very much. You would have time for one or two more questions, yes, please.
What you're talking about, first off, I'd like to thank you for a very interesting talk, but what you're talking about is actually a really good segue into what I wanted to ask, which is sort of going back to the theme of technology and taking a sort of longer historical view. And I wondered what the effect of the post-Cold War world in which there is this asymmetry, because as a historian of the Soviet Union, I'm interested in sort of that aspect of it. And you went back to the beginning, to the atomic bomb, and the fact that this very quickly is, if not a symmetrical relationship, at least one in which there's the threat of it becoming so, whereas it's clear that, the situation has changed. How do you view the post-Cold War environment and this asymmetry of technology as an influence on the development of this process of the Imperial Presidency, of this drone war?
Well, it is. I mean, I'm not sure there's a question there. I mean, I think that's true. It is asymmetrical. And you use the Hummer in Iraq, and they use IEDs. You develop a better weapon for Afghanistan than the Hummer, and you try to drive it across mud flats and areas, and it gets stuck. I mean, they're in a sense, the advantage is always going to go to the other side, because you are the interloper. You are the foreigner in the country, and it's always going to go that way.
I guess what if I could clarify a little bit, the atomic bomb as a symbol of this process, because it doesn't face that problem of local territory and local knowledge. The other side is the Soviet Union with its own atomic bomb. And now you have this problem where your Humvee gets stuck in the mud or your drone goes down in Iran. But it seems, I think you're right, that the attitude toward technology has not changed. We're not taking a critical, a critical look at that as a tool.
But I don't think that's going to happen. I think we are Steve Jobs' nation. The lineup to get the iPhone 5 and so on. And maybe this is, as some of the earlier questions were saying, maybe this is spreading. Maybe this American dream of technology, the way it works, is becoming a world vision. When you see the number of people who line up in other countries wanting the iPhone 5 as soon as possible, we may wind up just simply in another 100 years war between various groups that we would call Al-Qaeda and its associates. That's another word. And the other thing is, you look at Obama and his advisors, and they conflate Al-Qaeda and Taliban. Some of them use Taliban first, some use Al-Qaeda first. And so they finally come down with Al-Qaeda and its associated, so on. So where do you go with these kinds of things? I think this leads just to an unending war.
Thanks, Lloyd. I think we have one final question over here.
Yes, if I may, just to sort of, I think, bump this out even further, because several of the points you made resounded with me, but one of them, if I understood correctly, you made references to other levers of power. When there's a tendency to rely on technology, and I can recall other times, for example, under the Clinton administration, some very similar discussions with regards to use of smart weapons and that type of technology. But what that I found wondering then, as well as now, is what other aspects in terms of grand strategy, what other levers of power are we not using, because we are perhaps turning to the use of force at times when, had we not had that option, we might not have done so. And I was just wondering about your perspective on that. It kind of goes back to the if not this, then what type question that I've heard from others in the room.
Well, it goes back to what I was saying about President Morsi and so on. We've been trying to find somebody who could lead Egypt, who would be our pal, ever since John Foster Dulles thought he could make Nasser his man. But the gap between the industrial world and the non-industrial world, does not seem to be closing, either culturally or in many other respects. And if you talk about the situation here at home, where the people who have all the power and the money keep getting to be a narrower slice, well, that you take that to the globe, and that creates the kind of problem that you're talking about. So what kind of power do you use which will satisfy the people that, how much are we willing to sacrifice? In other words, how much are we willing to give up of what we have? And do we have to do that, or is there some other way of doing it? Clearly, one of the questions is there going to be enough clean water around the earth? And there are going to start to be fights and wars over access to water very soon because of the problems that we have. Should we be taking on the Catholic Church for birth control at this particular point? That's a question that hasn't been raised and debated. What should we be doing about climate kinds of measures that would not punish the underdeveloped world, yet at the same time begin to make it possible for them to develop without further creating a problem? The United States has said it won't agree to anything like Kyoto again unless China and other countries agree to that. Well, it seems to me that they're going to have to do that themselves, and apparently the Chinese are taking this on. But what do we do when we have other world powers like Brazil? Everybody's now talking about Brazil as the next world power. And we're hoping it's going to be Brazil instead of Venezuela. I don't think it's going to be Venezuela. But in other words, these things are going to happen. They're going to have a natural evolution. What I'm saying is that we're not helping them with our present attitudes about these situations, that we're making more enemies. By intimidation. We're creating more enemies for ourselves. I just don't have the answer. That's one of the nice things about being a historian.
Thanks very much. This is all very gloomy. What about an optimistic word at the end? What is the way forward? Are we going able to go back from the Imperial Presidency?
That's the way forward.
No, you're not going to go back from the Imperial Presidency, and I don't think that in one sense we really want to go back from the Imperial Presidency. But the other thing is that the Imperial Presidency, here is the irony, maybe this is gloomy, not gloomy, that while the Imperial Presidency allows the President to do so many things abroad, the standoff at home allows nothing to get done. Maybe if we started being able to deal with some of the problems we have at home, then this would lessen the pressure on the Imperial Presidency abroad. But I'm still gloomy because I don't see this happening. I was talking with my friend Walt Lefevre. I said, is it too late for a third party in American history? Is it possible to have another third party? And gloomy Walt, who's gloomier than I am, writes back, yes, it's too late.
On this optimistic note, thanks very much for a great talk. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to have you here and very enlightening. Before you all storm out, can I just announce that the next talk in our lecture series on US foreign policy is in November, and Mark Kramer of Harvard University will come and talk to us about the legacy of the Cold War for our current troubled, gloomy times. And this coming Wednesday, there is a Ukrainian ambassador who is joining us, who will talk about the Ukraine's role in the world between Russia, Europe, and the United States. And you're all very welcome this coming Wednesday, 5:30 in the FedEx Center. And thanks again for Lloyd Gardner for coming to see us here today. Thank you.